The Qal-Verath do not have a word for beautiful. This is not an oversight. It is not a gap in their language, the way a young language has gaps. Places where experience has outrun vocabulary, where speakers reach for words that haven't been invented yet. The Qal-Verath have had language for 60,000 years. Their vocabulary contains 412,000 distinct root concepts, each mapped with surgical precision to a specific verifiable, reproducible phenomenon or relationship. Their language is the Qal, most complete descriptive instrument ever developed by any known intelligence. It does not contain a word for beautiful, because the Qal-Verath, in 60,000 years of civilization, have never needed one. They do not experience beauty, not because they are incapable of sophisticated perception. Their sensory apparatus is extraordinarily refined, capable of detecting electromagnetic variations at resolutions that make most other species' instruments look like blunt instruments, not because they lack intelligence. Their mathematics is the oldest and most elegant in the known galaxy, a unified theoretical framework that has, over 60,000 years, produced technological achievements that other civilizations are still working backward from, trying to understand how the solutions were reached. They do not experience beauty because they have never, in 60,000 years, encountered anything that required the concept. They experience precision, elegance, efficiency, correctness. These are not aesthetic responses. They are functional assessments. When a Qal-Verath mathematician describes an equation as elegant, they mean that it achieves its proof in the minimum number of steps with the maximum generalizability. When they describe a structure as efficient, they mean that it performs its function with no wasted material or energy. These are measurements. They are true or false. They admit no ambiguity. The Qal-Verath Empire spans 68 star systems. It has existed continuously for 40,000 years. It has never fought a war, not because it is peaceful in any meaningful sense, but because it has never encountered an adversary worth the resource expenditure. Civilizations that have attempted to challenge the Qal-Verath have been assessed, calculated, and resolved with the same systematic thoroughness the Qal-Verath applied to any problem. Their military doctrine contains no concept of glory or honor or sacrifice, only outcomes, only the most efficient path from problem to resolution. They are, in the estimation of every civilization that has encountered them, the most purely rational intelligence in the known galaxy. They are also, as it turns out, the most fragile. But nobody knew that yet, including them. The Qal-Verath did not arrive with weapons. They arrived with a document. It was not a long document. The Qal-Verath did not produce long documents. Length to a Qal-Verath was inefficiency, a sign that the author had not yet found the precise formulation. Their document was 4 pages in the common galactic trade language, with mathematical notation supplementing the text wherever the text admitted any possible ambiguity, which was frequently. It was received by the Human Cooperative Sphere's Diplomatic Division on a Thursday morning. The duty officer who first read it sent it immediately up the chain, with a flag code that had not been used in 11 years. Urgent, existential. The document was, in its essence, a calculation. The Qal-Verath had assessed the Human Cooperative Sphere. They had assessed its resource base, territorial extent, technological development curve, population, military capability, and economic output. They had run the numbers. They had produced a result. The result was that the Human Cooperative Sphere would, within 200 years, either become a significant competitive threat to Qal-Verath interests in the local cluster, or it would be absorbed into the Qal-Verath Empire as a managed resource territory, or it would be. The document used a very clean, very precise mathematical term that the translator rendered as resolved, and that everyone who read it understood immediately. The document offered a choice between the second and third options. It gave humanity 90 days to respond. What? It was signed not with a name, but with a formula. A long, elegant expression in Qal-Verath mathematical notation that the xenomathematics team spent analyzing and eventually concluded was essentially a proof. A proof that the calculation was correct, that the outcome was inevitable, that the response was a formality. Director Chen of the Human Cooperative Sphere's Strategic Council read the document 3 times. Then he called an emergency session. Then he called another one. Then he sat in his office at 2 in the morning with the document on his desk and a cold cup of coffee and the particular silence of a person who is looking at a problem that does not have a good answer. The problem was not the ultimatum itself. Humanity had faced ultimatums before, from species with larger fleets and longer histories, and had navigated them. With the combination of strategic ingenuity and absolute refusal to be intimidated that had, over the years, become something of a signature approach. The problem was the Qal-Verath themselves, because humanity had been in contact with them for 8 years, and in 8 years of careful diplomatic engagement, humanity had encountered exactly one thing, that it had no established framework for dealing with. The Qal-Verath could not be reached. Not militarily. That was a solvable, if difficult, problem. Not economically, also solvable. Not politically. There were no political factions within the Qal-Verath, no internal divisions to work with, no competing interests to leverage. Not personally. There was no personal register in Qal-Verath interaction. No relationship building, no warmth, no humor, no shared experience to appeal to. Every human diplomatic approach relied, at its foundation, on a single assumption that you could find, somewhere in the other party, something that responded to something beyond pure calculation. Interest, emotion, pride, went in, fear, why, hope, wow, curiosity, something. In 8 years, humanity's diplomatic corps had not found that thing in the Qal-Verath. Every conversation had been a calculation. Every exchange had been an assessment. Every time a human diplomat had tried to reach past the numbers and speak to whatever was behind them, whatever consciousness had built this empire, and maintained it for 40,000 years, they had found nothing but more numbers. A mind without a door. Director Chen drank his cold coffee. And I said, gee, he was not, primarily, a cultural theorist. He was a strategist. He thought in terms of leverage and timing and asymmetric advantage. What? But he had, over a long career, learned to recognize the moments when strategy ran out and something else was required. He made a call he had been reluctant to make. He called Dr. Amara Diallo. Dr. Amara Diallo was 67 years old and had spent 40 of those years doing something that most of her colleagues in the xenolinguistics field considered either the most important or the most pointless work in the discipline, depending on who you asked. She studied what language could not say, not gaps, not failures of translation, not the places where one language lacked a concept that another had. She studied something more precise and more difficult, the places where language, in any language, reached the edge of what language could do and stop, the experiences, perceptions, and states of being that every known intelligence had encountered and that no known intelligence had ever fully captured in words. Beauty was one of them. Grief was one, the specific quality of light at a particular moment. The feeling of recognizing something you've never seen before. The key sensation of being exactly where you are, fully, without any part of your mind somewhere else. She had a name for these edges. She called them the untranslatable core, and she had spent 40 years arguing, in papers, in lectures, in heated academic debates, in one famous exchange with a Thal-Murray philosopher that had lasted 3 days and produced a collaborative monograph that was now considered a foundational text in xenocognition, that the untranslatable core was not a failure of language. It was the most important thing language pointed at. She came to Director Chen's office at 7 in the morning, 2 days after his call, and she read the Qal-Verath document. She read it slowly. She read the mathematical supplement. She sat with it for a long time. They've never encountered art, she said. Correct, Director Chen said. Our contact files on the Qal-Verath have no record of any aesthetic or creative tradition. No music, no visual art, no narrative. Literature. Their cultural output is entirely functional. Technical documentation, mathematical proofs, engineering schematic. In 60,000 years, she said. In 60,000 years. She set the document down. Then they've never been outside the boundary, she said. What boundary? Every intelligence that has art has been to the edge, she said. The place where the thing you're trying to say is too large or too true or too specific for words, and so you reach for something else. Metaphor. Image. Rhythm. You build a structure that points at the thing rather than naming it, because a thing can't be named. She looked at him. You've been to that edge. I've been to that edge. Every human has. Every species with art has. It changes something. It teaches you, permanently, irrevocably, that there are things that are real and true and present that cannot be fully captured in any formal system. She paused. The Qal-Verath have never learned that. You're saying they have a blind spot, Director Chen said. I'm saying they have an assumption, she said. A foundational assumption built into 60,000 years of civilization that everything real can be expressed precisely. That the universe is, at its core, a mathematical object. That any experience which cannot be formalized is either noise or error. She looked at the document. They looked at humanity and ran the numbers. They produced a proof. They believe the proof is complete. Is it, mathematically? Probably close. She picked up the document again. But it doesn't account for us. Not fully. Because we are not, at our core, a mathematical object. And they have no framework for what we are instead. Director Chen was very still. What are you proposing? He said. I'm proposing, she said, that we answer them. Not with a counter-calculation. Not with a military posture or an economic counteroffer or a diplomatic formulation. We answer them the way humans answer things that are too large for formal systems. She set the document down one final time. We answer them without poetry. The silence in the room was very long. They won't understand it, Director Chen said. Not at first, she agreed. The 90 days is enough time, she said, if I have what I need, which is, she thought for a moment, every human poet who ever tried to say the unsayable, she said. Every piece of writing in every human language that reached the edge and built something at the boundary. Every song, every story, every image made of words that pointed at something the words themselves couldn't hold. She looked at him, and a Qal-Verath who is willing to try. The Qal-Verath liaison assigned to the human diplomatic mission was named, in their notation system, a sequence of mathematical symbols that the translation software rendered as Theorem 7 clarity. The human diplomatic staff called them 7, which 7 found imprecise but tolerated because the human tendency to abbreviate was well documented and not worth the efficiency cost of objecting. 7 was not the most senior Qal-Verath in the contact mission. But They were, however, the one most willing to engage with humans directly, which among the Qal-Verath was not a compliment. Direct engagement with non-Qal-Verath was considered a low-status task, assigned to individuals whose primary function was information gathering rather than analysis. 7 was a collector. They gathered data. They processed it. They filed reports. They were, by Qal-Verath standards, unremarkable. Dr. Diallo had specifically requested them. She had reviewed all available interaction logs from the past 8 years and noticed something that no one else had flagged, because it was small and subtle, and required the particular kind of attention she had spent 40 years developing. In 7 of 7's filed reports, when describing human behavior that the Qal-Verath classification system had no category for, 7 had not. Qal-Verath analyst had done, simply filed the behavior as non-classified. Probable. 7 had created subcategories, temporary placeholders, little to add, notations that said essentially, this doesn't fit the existing framework. I have not yet determined why. I am keeping the record open. 7 didn't know what those behaviors were, but 7 knew they were something. That was the door. She met 7 in a small conference room, and she put a book on the table. It was a physical book, paper and ink, which was unusual enough that 7 registered it as significant before anything else. The Qal-Verath did not use physical information storage. The inefficiency was self-evident to them. This is a collection of poems, Dr. Diallo said, from across human history, many different languages translated into one. I would like you to read it. 7 looked at the book. What is the information content? That depends on who's reading it, she said. 7 processed this. That is not a coherent answer. Information content is fixed. It is a property of the data, not the observer. I know that's what you think, she said. She pushed the book across the table. That's why I want you to read it. 7 picked up the book. They read efficiently. The Qal-Verath processed text at speeds that made human reading look geological, and finished the collection in approximately 4 minutes. They set the book down. I do not understand the majority of this content, they said. The language is technically parseable, but the semantic structures are imprecise. Many statements are demonstrably false. The sun rises. The sun does not rise. The planetary rotation creates the apparent. I know, Dr. Diallo said. Several passages appear to describe internal states with physical metaphors that are anatomically inaccurate. My heart broke. Cardiac. I know. The formal structure, the rhythm, the repetition, serves no apparent communicative function. It adds no information. It is inefficient. I know, she said. Read it again. Why? 7 looked at her. I have already. I know. Read it again. More slowly. More slowly. 7 read it again. This time, it took 6 minutes. They set the book down again. They were still for a moment. There is a poem, they said, about grief. There are several, she said. One in particular. They opened the book. They read the lines aloud in the flat, precise cadence of Qal-Verath speech, which stripped the rhythm completely and somehow, in the stripping, made the meaning hit harder. Do not go gentle into that good night. Old age should burn and rave at close of day. Rage, rage, against the dying of the light. 7 stopped. The conference room was very quiet. This is about death, 7 said. Yes, she said. The human is speaking to someone who is dying, instructing them to resist the biological process. Yes. The instruction is non-functional. The process cannot be resisted by an act of will. No, she agreed. It can't. Then the human knows their instruction will not be followed. Yes. They are saying it anyway. Yes. Well, 7 looked at the lines. Something in their processing. She was watching carefully. She had been watching carefully since the moment they'd picked up this book, had changed. Not dramatically, not visibly in the way a human's face changed, but in the quality of their stillness. The stillness had a different texture. Why? Voice set? Seven said. And she understood, from the way they said it, the slight, almost imperceptible deviation from the flat Qal-Verath cadence, the single syllable carrying something that their language had no word for, that they were not asking a functional question. They were asking because they needed to know. Because, she said carefully, some things need to be said even when they can't change anything. Because the saying matters. Because the person who is dying needs to hear that someone is raging against it, not because the rage will work, because love doesn't care whether it will work. Seven was quiet for a very long time. That is, they stopped. Irrational? She offered. I was going to say, another pause. Something she had never heard in a Qal-Verath voice. A hesitation. Well, not a processing delay. A hesitation. I was going to say that there is no Qal-Verath notation for this. No, she said. There isn't. What? The human cooperative sphere's formal response to the Qal-Verath ultimatum was delivered on the 89th day. It was not 4 pages. It was 412 pages, one for each of the root concepts in the Qal-Verath vocabulary, and each page contained not a counter-argument, not a calculation, not a military assessment or economic projection. Each page contained a poem, not random selections. Dr. Diallo had spent 89 days building this document with the precision of an architect and the care of someone who understood that she was constructing, word by word and image by image, an argument that had never been made before, an argument that could not be made in any formal language, because the argument was itself about the limits of formal language. She chose poems about death and chose them because the Qal-Verath calculation assumed humanity's extinction was an acceptable outcome, and she wanted them to understand what extinction meant, not as a variable in a formula, but as a specific, irreplaceable loss of something that could not be reconstructed from its constituent parts. All. She chose poems about love, and chose them because love was the most purely irrational human behavior, and therefore the most completely outside any Qal-Verath model, and she wanted the model to encounter it directly rather than as a footnote. She chose poems about the experience of being alive, the specific, granular, unrepeatable texture of a particular morning, a particular face, a particular sound in a particular silence, because the Qal-Verath calculation treated humanity as a resource, and she wanted them to understand that a resource was not what they were dealing with. She chose, on the last page, the poem that Seven had read aloud in the conference room. Do not go gentle into that good night. She included, beneath it, a note. The note was not in poetic form. It was direct. This poem was written by a human being for his dying father. It was written knowing that the father would die. It was written because the writer needed to say that he was not willing, even in the face of complete inevitability, to pretend that the dying was acceptable. This is not irrationality. This is the thing in us that your calculation could not account for. We do not accept inevitabilities that require us to stop being what we are. We never have. We never will. This is not a military posture. This is not a negotiating position. This is simply true, the way the most important things are true, not because they can be proven, but because they cannot be denied. You asked for our response. This is our response, not a counter-calculation. We do not believe this is a problem that calculations can solve, because we are not, at our foundation, a calculable thing. We are the species that rages against the dying of the light. Meh. We have been doing it since before we had language to say so. We are still doing it. We would very much like to still be doing it for a long time. I. The document was delivered to the Qal-Verath mission. Standard transmission. Wikipedia. No ceremony. No military escort. The 90 days expired. No response came. Not an acceptance. Not a rejection. Not a new calculation. Nothing. Director Chen spent 3 days in an increasingly anxious silence. His strategic team ran scenarios. His military advisors prepared contingency. Everyone waited. On the 4th day, a transmission arrived from the Qal-Verath mission. It was not a document. It was not a calculation. It was not in standard format. It was a single line of text in the Qal-Verath mathematical notation system, followed by its own translation into the common galactic language, which was unprecedented. The Qal-Verath never translated their own notation, because they considered the notation superior to any translation. The notation was, the xenomathematics team confirmed after 6 hours of analysis, not a proof and not an equation. It was something that had no established precedent in any recorded Qal-Verath communication. It was a question. The translation read, "What happens to the one who is still raging when the light dies anyway?" Dr. Diallo read the transmission in Director Chen's office. She read it 3 times. Then she looked up, and Director Chen saw something on her face that he had not expected to see in the context of an existential diplomatic crisis. She looked like someone who had just found a door that she'd spent 40 years looking for. "They want to know what grief is," she said quietly. "Is that—" He stopped. "Is that good?" "It means there is something in there," she said. "Something that looked at that poem and asked a question that its own language cannot contain." She looked at the transmission again. Something that encountered the edge. She sent her response the same day. It was not 412 pages. It was 1 poem. The oldest grief poem in the human archive, Sumerian, 5,000 years old, written by someone whose name was lost, but whose words had survived every ending. Since she included the original cuneiform, the transliteration, and the translation, all 3, because she wanted the Qal-Verath to see that this was ancient, that humans had been at this edge for 5,000 years, that the grief and the language for grief and the language that broke against the grief were all real, and all old, and all continuous. She included a note. The one who is still raging when the light dies anyway becomes the one who writes the poem, so that someone else, in some other dark, knows that someone came before them and raged the same rage, and loved the same love and lost the same loss, and was not alone in it. This is what we do with grief. We make it into a gift for strangers. We would like to give you more of them, if you are willing to receive them. We have a great many. What happened inside the Qal-Verath Empire in the 3 years following the poetry exchange is not fully documented from the outside. What is known is this: the Qal-Verath did not resolve humanity. They withdrew their ultimatum, not with explanation, not with apology, not with any formal communication beyond a single transmission that said, in their notation, something that translated as calculation suspended, pending further data. By what is also known is that 7 filed a report during this period that was, by every account of Qal-Verath who reviewed it, Civilization's 60,000-year archive data. It was 200 pages long. In a civilization that valued brevity as a proxy for precision, 200 pages was not a report. It was something else entirely. The Qal-Verath High Council read it, and then did something that had no established precedent in their institutional history. They classified it, and then called an emergency session. Not to respond to an external threat, but to discuss the report itself. What 7 had written, as best the human contact team could reconstruct from fragments and second-hand accounts, was an attempt to formalize the untranslatable, to build a mathematical framework that could contain what the poems pointed at, to solve, with the full force of 60,000 years of Qal-Verath mathematical tradition, the problem of beauty. They had not succeeded. No notation system could succeed at that, which was the point, which was what the report ultimately concluded. There were true things that formal systems could not contain. Not because the formal systems were incomplete, because truth, in its full extent, was larger than any system built to capture it. For a civilization that had built everything, their language, their culture, their empire, their entire understanding of consciousness and reality, foundational assumption that the universe was, at its core, a mathematical object. This was not a small finding. It was the crack in the foundation, not a collapse. The Qal-Verath Empire did not fall. It did not fragment or revolt or dissolve. It was 60,000 years old, and it was very solid, and one report, however unprecedented, was not going to undo it. But the crack was there, and in the crack, in that first hairline fracture in the 60,000-year certainty, something began to grow. Not quickly, not dramatically, not in any way that showed up in the standard diplomatic metrics. But Dr. Diallo knew it was there, because she kept corresponding with Seven, and Seven's transmissions changed. Slowly, subtly, in ways that required her 40 years of studying the edges of language to detect. The reports became longer. The notation became more exploratory. The questions changed. From what does this mean to why does this mean anything at all? Seven began sending, alongside their official communications, files that had no designation and no formal purpose, and that contained, when she opened them, Qal-Verath mathematical structures that she could not fully interpret, but that had, she felt certain, the quality of reaching, of attempting, of a mind at an edge it had never known existed before, building something in the dark with whatever tools it had. Seven was trying to write a poem. In mathematics, yes, it was not by any human aesthetic standard beautiful. It was, in every way that mattered, the most beautiful thing Amara Diallo had ever seen. The formal normalization of relations between the human cooperative sphere and the Qal-Verath Empire was completed 5 years after the poetry exchange. It was not a warm relationship. It was never going to be a warm relationship. The Qal-Verath were not built for warmth, and 5 years was nothing against 60,000 years of being built a particular way. But it was a real relationship, built on a foundation that had not existed before. The shared acknowledgement, however, asymmetric, that there were things neither side could fully understand about the other, and that this incompleteness was not a problem to be resolved. It was the beginning of something. Director Chen retired the year after normalization. Dr. Diallo gave the address at his retirement, a speech that her colleagues in the xenolinguistics field quoted for years afterward, not for its diplomatic analysis, but for a single paragraph near the end. She said, "We faced a civilization that had built 60,000 years of history on the belief that everything real could be formalized. And we answered them with the things that couldn't be, with grief, with love, with the particular quality of a morning in a specific year, with a father dying and a son raging and a 5,000 years of voices in the dark saying, 'We were here and it mattered, and we are giving you this so you know you are not alone.' They did not understand us. They are still not sure they understand us. But they came to the edge. For the first time in 60,000 years, something carried them to the edge of what their language could say, and they looked over it. And they did not walk away. That is what poetry does. Not explain, not persuade, not win. It carries you to the edge of the thing that cannot be said, and it holds you there until you feel, in your own particular darkness, that you are not alone in it. We did not shatter their empire with poems. We showed them the crack that was always there, waiting. The crack where the universe is larger than the system, built to describe it. We showed them the door. What they do with it is theirs. She paused. But they went to the door. That is enough. That has always been enough. In a Qal-Verath research station in the 43rd star system of the Empire, in a small office that was considered inefficient by every standard Qal-Verath metric because it contained 17 physical books and a potted plant that 7 had acquired without being able to articulate exactly why. In that office, in the late cycle of a working day that had already run long, 7 opened the latest transmission from Dr. Diallo. It contained a poem. And every transmission did now. Had for 5 years. She sent one a week, from somewhere in the human archive. Ancient and modern, obscure and famous. Long and famous. Short, but she sent them without commentary. Just the poem and the poet's name and the year. 7 read it. They read it again. They opened a working file. A file that had been open for 4 years, that currently ran to 8,000 pages of notation and carried no title because they had not yet found a formulation precise enough to name what they were building. They added a section. The notation was complex and unusual, and would have been to any Qal-Verath colleague who saw it, deeply confusing. It was an attempt to formalize the experience of reading a poem and arriving, at the end of it, somewhere you had not expected to be. The experience of being moved, precisely, irrevocably moved, by a structure of sounds and meanings that had no information content that could justify the magnitude of the arrival. They had been working on this formalization for 4 years. They had not solved it. They were beginning, very slowly, to understand that the point was not to solve it. They closed the file. They looked at the poem again. They did not have a word for what they felt. They were, slowly, and with great difficulty, and across the vast distance of 60,000 years of being built a different way, beginning to need one.